Luke Morgan had hit rock bottom. His last $70 were gone, spent on a storage unit filled with nothing but moldy trash and despair. He slumped onto the cold concrete floor, a defeated veteran, ready to give up. But his dog, Kaiser, refused to settle. The German shepherd, ignoring his master's command, moved to the unit's back wall. He began to scratch, whining urgently at a specific spot on the stained plywood. This wasn't the excited scratching of a dog chasing rats. It was focused, insistent, and deliberate. Frustrated, Luke moved to pull Kaiser away, but then he froze. He saw what Kaiser had found, the water stains on the wall. They weren't stains. They were perfectly straight, geometric lines. That wasn't a wall. It was a door. Please support us by subscribing to our channel. The cold in Pittsburgh was not just a temperature, it was a physical weight. It pressed down from the iron-gray sky, radiated from the frozen asphalt, and crept up from the banks of the Monongahela River, carrying the smell of ice and old industry. Luke Morgan felt it in the scar tissue of his left knee, a dull ache that synchronized with the rhythm of his breathing. He sat huddled against a concrete pylon, shielded from the worst of the wind, but not from the damp that seemed to live inside the cement itself. He was a man built tall and lean, but the layers of worn clothing softened his angles. A faded brown leather jacket, cracked and stiff from years of exposure, was pulled tight over a flannel shirt. His face was obscured by a rough, patchy beard, and his brown hair, grown long and unruly, was streaked with silver at the temples. He looked older than his 41 years, his features weathered by hardship, yet his eyes retained a deep, quiet kindness that seemed out of place in the gray landscape. Pressed against his right side, absorbing and returning warmth, was Kaiser. Kaiser was a German shepherd, 7 years old, with a thick coat of muted gray and white that looked almost ethereal in the dim light. He was a large dog, powerful in the shoulders and deep in the chest, but his temperament was one of profound stillness. His intelligent amber-colored eyes watched the slow-moving traffic on the overpass above, his ears twitching at the whine of tires on the icy road. But his body remained relaxed, a living anchor tethered to Luke. Luke's gaze was fixed on the river, but he wasn't seeing the ice flows. He was somewhere else entirely, pulled under by a sound that had ripped through the air moments before. A city bus on the bridge above had applied its brakes, resulting in a sharp pressurized hiss. It was the sound of failing hydraulics. He was no longer under a bridge in Pittsburgh. He was in the dry heat of a forward operating base, the air thick with dust and the smell of diesel. He saw Dean with his loud laugh and the picture of his wife and new daughter taped to his dashboard. They were supposed to be checking the winch on the recovery vehicle. The hiss. The sudden, terrible snap of the cable. The catastrophic failure of the lift mechanism. Luke hadn't been close enough to be hurt, only close enough to watch, helpless, as the multi-ton vehicle component slipped, crushing Dean instantly. But that wasn't the memory that truly haunted him. The death was a tragedy, sudden and violent, the kind soldiers are forced to expect. The cold anchor that held Luke at the bottom of the river was what came after. It was the memory of a sterile room, the scent of industrial floor cleaner, and the face of his superior, Captain Alex Hunter. Alex Hunter was a man with a granite jaw and eyes that held no light, a man who saw the world in terms of acceptable losses and protected assets. Luke, still in shock, had filed his report. Faulty hydraulics, substandard parts. He had mentioned the other complaints, the ones that had been ignored. Hunter had listened, his expression unchanged. Then he had produced his own report. Operator error, it said. Sir, Luke had protested, his voice, ho-da-ba-da-ba-boo-da-boo-ba-you. The ground was unstable, sir. The ground was fine, Morgan, Hunter had said, his voice quiet but absolute. Your report is mistaken. It was a tragic accident caused by Dean's failure to follow safety protocols. That is the official finding. But, sir, the hydraulics. The contract with that supplier is vital to our operational readiness, Hunter had cut in, his eyes turning to ice. We will not jeopardize that over a single, unfortunate incident. You are dismissed, Sergeant. Luke had stood there, his insides turning to stone. Dean was buried, and so was the truth. It was a cover-up, clean and simple, designed to protect a lucrative government contract. The system he had sworn his life to, the honor he had built himself around, had evaporated in that sterile room. He had lost his faith, not to an enemy bullet, but to a signature on a false report. His discharge, which came 6 months later, felt less like an ending and more like a fall, and he had been falling ever since. A low whine pulled Luke back to the present. Kaiser had shifted, pushing his cold nose insistently under Luke's glove. The dog's eyes were fixed on him, full of a patient understanding that asked for nothing but presence. "I'm here, boy," Luke murmured, his voice rough. He scrubbed the dog's thick ruff. "I'm okay." He was lying. The meager shelter they had maintained under the bridge was no longer secure. A white municipal truck had pulled up earlier, and a man in a thick city-issued coat had approached them. He wasn't unkind, just firm. "Fellas, I'm sorry," the man said, looking at Luke and then at the dog. "New directive. We've got to clear this area. Liability? You can't stay here." Luke had simply nodded, the familiar shame washing over him. He knew how to follow orders. He packed his few belongings, a sleeping bag, a small cookpot, a tarp, into the shopping cart that held his life. Now, with the sun beginning to dip and the temperature dropping rapidly, they were exposed. "Well, Kaiser," Luke said, standing up and stretching his aching knee. "Guess we're moving." Kaiser stood instantly, shaking the frost from his coat. Ready. Luke pushed the wobbly cart onto the sidewalk, his mind racing. Shelters were full, and most wouldn't take Kaiser. He would never abandon the dog. They were a single unit. His eyes scanned the skyline across the river. Looming against the fading light, like the skeleton of a forgotten giant, was the Meridian Steelworks. The steel mill had been shuttered since the late 1980s, a massive monument to a dead industry. It was acres of rusting metal, broken glass, and concrete canyons. It was also, Luke knew, incredibly dangerous and strictly off-limits. Locals avoided it, believing it haunted by the ghosts of displaced workers. But it was a roof. It took them nearly an hour to cross the bridge and navigate the crumbling service roads that led to the mill's perimeter. The chain-link fence was high, but time had been kind to them. Near a collapsed loading dock, a section of the fence had rusted through at the bottom, leaving a gap just wide enough to slip through. Luke pushed the cart as far as he could, then unfastened his pack and the sleeping bag. He would have to leave the cart behind. He and Kaiser slipped through the gap into the profound, echoing silence of the dead factory. The main foundry floor was a graveyard of machinery. Moonlight slanted through the shattered skylights, illuminating hulking, silent shapes. It was colder inside than it had been on the street, the metal radiating a deep, penetrating chill. "This way," Luke whispered, more to himself than to the dog. Kaiser moved beside him, silent as a shadow, his head high and alert. Luke remembered this place from a brief, desperate scouting mission months ago. He bypassed the main floor, heading toward a smaller, separate structure he had seen near the old administrative block. He found it, a small brick building set apart from the main works. The sign above the door, barely legible, read, "Security Office." The wooden door was thick and the lock had been broken long ago, but the door itself was still on its hinges. Luke pushed it open with a sound of grinding rusted metal. Inside, it was pitch black. Luke fumbled for the small flashlight on his keychain. The beam cut through decades of dust. It was a single room, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. A heavy steel desk sat against one wall, a moldering chair beside it. But the window, though filmed with grime, was not broken. The roof, miraculously, seemed intact. The floor was concrete, littered with dead leaves that had blown in under the door, but it was dry. It was safe. Luke dropped his pack against the wall and let out a breath he felt he had been holding since morning. The air was stale, smelling of plaster and decay. But it was still. Kaiser sniffed every corner of the small room. his claws making soft clicking sounds on the concrete. Finally, he returned to the pack, circled twice, and lay down with a heavy sigh, resting his head on his paws, his eyes closing. He was home. Luke sat on the floor, his back against the cold wall, and placed a hand on Kaiser's flank. The dog was his anchor, the only thing that kept him from drifting away completely. Here, in the frozen heart of the Meridian Steelworks, they had found a small, cold harbor. The security office at the Meridian Steelworks was a refuge, but it was not a home. When the weak gray light of morning filtered through the grime-caked window, it revealed the stark reality of their situation. The shelter was dry, but it was as cold inside as it was out. Luke woke stiffly, his bones aching. Kaiser was already awake, sitting patiently, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The dog's intelligent eyes were fixed on Luke, his tail unmoving. It was a look Luke knew well. It was hunger. Luke's stomach clenched in response. He reached for his pack and checked their supplies. The inventory was grim, half a bag of kibble for Kaiser and the last heel of a loaf of bread for himself. He had $73 and some change folded into a small plastic bag in his pocket. It was the last of his disability payment from 2 weeks ago. It wasn't enough to get a room, and it was barely enough to eat for a few more days. But it was too much to simply sit on. He remembered a damp flyer he had picked up at a bus stop days ago, an advertisement he had glanced at and dismissed. He fished the crumpled paper from his jacket pocket. Pine Ridge Storage, it read. Delinquent unit auction. Cash only. It was a desperate gamble. He knew these auctions were a long shot, mostly filled with professionals who knew what they were doing. But he also knew that sometimes people found things, tools, furniture, something, anything, that could be sold for a small profit. Enough to buy another bag of dog food and supplies for another week. "What do you think, boy?" Luke murmured, showing the flyer to Kaiser. The dog sniffed the paper and sneezed. "It's a chance. It's the only one we've got." He divided the last of the kibble for Kaiser and ate the stale bread. He secured the small office as best he could, and they slipped back out into the frozen city. The Pine Ridge storage facility was on the industrial edge of the south side, a sprawling complex of identical gray buildings with bright blue roll-up doors. A small crowd of about 20 people was gathered near the main office, most of them men with pickup trucks and empty cargo vans. They looked warm, professional, and confident. Luke, in his worn leather jacket with Kaiser at his side, felt immediately out of place. He pulled his collar tighter and stayed at the back of the group. A man in a bright orange vest over a heavy coat stepped out, holding a clipboard. This was Mason Lee, the auctioneer. He had a fast, rhythmic voice that cut through the cold air, a voice that wasted no time on pleasantries. "All right, folks, welcome to Pine Ridge. You know the rules. You look, you don't touch. Cash only, due immediately. You win it, you have 48 hours to clear it to the floor. Let's get started." He motioned to a worker who cut the lock on the first unit. The metal door rattled as it rolled upward. Luke watched for the next hour as his hope dwindled. The professionals were fast. They would shine bright flashlights into the units, make near-instant calculations, and the bidding would start. A unit filled with what looked like antique furniture went for $800. Another, packed with tools and machinery, climbed to $1,200. Luke didn't even bother watching. He just stroked Kaiser's head, feeling the warmth of the dog's fur under his glove, and tried to ignore the growing pit of failure in his stomach. Finally, Mason Lee moved to the very last unit in the row, separate from the others. "All right, folks, last one for the day, Unit 412. Tenant delinquent 9 months. Looks like a backload. We're cutting the lock now." A worker snapped the heavy padlock with bolt cutters. The sound was sharp and final. Mason Lee and the worker both strained to pull the rattling door upward. It stuck, then flew open with a groan of protesting metal. The professionals shined their lights inside, held their gaze for less than 10 seconds, and then scoffed. One by one, they turned and began walking back toward their trucks. "Okay, folks, "What do we have here?" Mason Lee chanted, trying to keep the energy up. Luke stepped forward to see what the others had rejected. Unit 412 was a pit. It was 10 feet deep and packed with sagging cardboard boxes, their sides dark and soft with mildew. A broken floor lamp lay on its side. Black plastic trash bags were piled in one corner, some split open to reveal stained, moldy clothing. The smell that washed out of the unit was a sickening mix of damp paper, decay, and time. It was worthless. "Let's start the bidding at $50, Mason Lee called out to the retreating crowd. No one turned. $50 for the whole lot. Come on, folks, help me clear the lot. $20? Do I hear 20? Absolute silence. Mason Lee sighed, annoyed. He looked around, his eyes landing on the only person still standing there. Luke. "You with the dog. $20? It's all yours," Mason said, just wanting to be done. Luke's heart was pounding. It was junk. But it was something. He thought of the $70 in his pocket. "I'll give you 50, Luke said, his voice surprisingly steady. A man who had been walking away paused. 60? The man called out, probably just for the sport of it. Luke's stomach tightened. 70, he said, the word coming out faster than he intended. It was everything. The other man laughed and waved his hand in dismissal. $70 it is, Mason Lee shouted, relieved. Going once, going twice. Sold to the gentleman with the dog for $70. Luke walked forward, his hand trembling slightly as he pulled the wadded-up bills from his pocket. He was now completely broke. Mason Lee took the cash and handed him a carbon copy receipt. "She's all yours. You've got 48 hours to clear it out," Mason said, not unkindly. He glanced at Kaiser. "Good-looking dog. Good luck to you." The auctioneer and the last of the buyers left. The lot was silent, save for the wind whistling around the corner of the building. It was just Luke, Kaiser, and the black gaping rectangle of Unit 412. "Well, boy," Luke whispered, his throat dry. "Let's see what we bought." He stepped inside, and the full force of the smell hit him. It was overwhelming. He pulled his flashlight from his pack and shined it around. It was worse than he thought. The cardboard boxes were so damp they were disintegrating. When he touched one, it simply collapsed, revealing a sodden mass of old newspapers and magazines, fused together into a solid, moldy brick. He spent the next hour digging, his hope turning to cold, hard despair. There were no tools. There was no furniture, save for a three-legged stool and a rusted metal shelf. It was just the accumulated, forgotten refuse of a life. Moth-eaten blankets, cracked dishes, yellowed paperbacks that fell apart in his hands. It was nothing. He had spent his last $70 on garbage. The weight of his failure pressed down on him, heavier than the Pittsburgh cold. He had failed Kaiser. He had failed himself. He was right back where Alex Hunter had left him, a man whose judgment was worthless, a man who had lost everything. He slid down the wall and sat on the cold concrete floor, burying his face in his gloves. He felt the old, familiar shadow of his trauma wrap around him. He was pulled from the darkness by a sound, a persistent, whining, scratching sound. He looked up. Kaiser was at the very back of the small, 10-foot-deep unit. The back wall was covered in a single, large, cheap-looking sheet of plywood, stained and peeling. Kaiser was standing on his hind legs, his nose pressed firmly against the wood, sniffing intently. He whined again, then dropped to all fours and began to scratch at the base of the panel. "Kaiser, stop," Luke commanded, his voice tired and empty. "Leave it. It's just rats, boy. There's nothing back there for us." Kaiser paused, looked back at Luke, and then turned and scratched again, harder this time, letting out a low, insistent huff. This wasn't the excited scratch of chasing prey. It was focused. It was deliberate. Luke sighed and pushed himself to his feet, his knee protesting. He owed the dog his attention. All right, I see it. What is it?" He walked to the back of the unit, the beam of his flashlight playing over the plywood. He gently pushed Kaiser aside. "What have you got, boy?" He inspected the panel where Kaiser had been scratching. It was just damp, cheap wood. But as he shined the light upward, he noticed what his mind had dismissed earlier. The water stains. They didn't spread and bloom outward like normal water damage from a leak. They were perfectly straight. 2 long vertical lines of discoloration running from the ceiling to the floor, about 3 feet apart. Luke ran his fingers along the stains. They weren't stains, they were seams. He realized he wasn't looking at one solid sheet of plywood. It was a section deliberately fitted between 2 other panels, and Kaiser wasn't just scratching at rats. The dog had smelled something different, a draft of air coming from the gap. Luke pressed his hand against the panel. It was loose. It shifted slightly under his weight. This wasn't a structural wall. Luke's heart gave a single, hard jolt. He looked around the junk-filled unit, and his eyes landed on a rusted tire iron half buried under a pile of rags. He grabbed it, returned to the wall, and wedged the flat end into the seam that Kaiser had found. The tire iron felt cold and heavy in Luke's gloved hand. He jammed the flat end into the thin seam Kaiser had exposed, putting his shoulder into it. The plywood was damp and soft, giving way easily. He heard a dull, tearing sound as the wood fibers ripped, followed by the faint protest of old nails pulling free. He pried the panel back, the bottom edge scraping against the concrete, and it fell forward with a soft thud into the dust of the storage unit. Kaiser, vindicated, pushed his nose into the opening, sniffing the rush of cold, stale air that escaped from the darkness. Luke dropped the tire iron and aimed his flashlight into the hole. It was exactly as the straight seams had suggested, a false wall. Behind it lay a narrow, dark void, a man-made gap between the plywood and the true concrete block wall of the unit. The space was no more than 2 feet deep, an intentional, carefully constructed hiding place. And it was not empty. Luke's breath caught. The beam of his light, cutting through the thick, swirling dust motes, landed on 3 objects sitting neatly on the concrete floor of the hidden space. They were not tossed in. They had been placed. His heart, which had been a cold stone of despair moments before, began a low, heavy drumbeat. He knelt, telling Kaiser to stay, and reached into the cramped void. The first item his fingers touched was a small wooden box. It was dark, perhaps mahogany, and smooth to the touch, about the size of a thick paperback novel. It was surprisingly light. The second was a large manila folder, thick with papers. It was stiff, and the flap was sealed not with glue, but with a thick, ominous-looking circle of dark red wax, stamped with an insignia he couldn't make out in the dim light. The seal was unbroken. The third item was at the back. He had to stretch to reach it. It was a metal box. It was not a simple cash box. It looked like a military-grade ammunition case, painted flat black. It was heavy, and when he slid it forward, he saw 3 high-quality combination tumbler locks securing the lid. Luke pulled the 3 items out of the void and set them on the grimy floor of the unit, staring at them. The trash bags, the moldy magazines, the $70 mistake. All of it faded. This was not junk. This was a secret. Kaiser whined softly, pressing his head against Luke's arm, sensing the sudden sharp shift in his tension. "It's okay, boy," Luke murmured, his voice hoarse. "I don't know what this is, but you found it. You found it." His first instinct was to open them, right here, but a cold prickle of awareness ran up his spine. The unit door was wide open. He was exposed. The facility owner had his name on a receipt. This was not the place. He looked at the metal box. The 3 locks were a clear message. Keep out. He looked at the wooden box, but it was the wax-sealed folder that held his attention. It promised answers. "We're going back," Luke said, his voice firm. He quickly repacked his meager supplies. He placed the small wooden box and the sealed folder deep inside his backpack. The metal case was too large. He wrapped it in his own sleeping bag, sacrificing his own warmth for its concealment, and tucked the bundle under his arm. It was heavy, but the adrenaline surging through him made it feel manageable. He didn't bother looking at the rest of the unit's contents. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he had already found everything of value. He pulled the rolling door down until it was only a foot from the ground, just enough for them to slip out, then kick the panel of plywood back into place to cover the hole. It wouldn't hold against inspection, but it would hide the void from a casual glance. The walk back to the Meridian Steelworks was a blur of heightened awareness. Every car that passed, every distant siren, made the muscles in his neck tighten. The weight of the box under his arm was a constant, dangerous reminder. Kaiser, too, was on edge, walking in a tight, protective heel, his ears erect and swiveling, sensing Luke's fear. When they finally slipped back through the broken fence and into the cavernous silence of the steel mill, Luke felt a small measure of relief. He navigated the debris-strewn floor back to the small brick security office, their cold, dry sanctuary. He pushed the door closed, wedging the broken chair under the knob, a useless gesture, but it made him feel safer. He sat on the floor, Kaiser settling immediately at his back, a warm, living guard. Luke clicked on his flashlight and propped it against the rusted desk, aiming the beam at the floor. He unwrapped the metal box and set it aside. The locks were impossible. He picked up the wooden box, ran his thumb over the smooth lid. It felt like a box for photographs or letters. Finally, he took the thick manila folder. He held it for a long moment. The red wax seal was brittle with age. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and broke the seal with his thumb. It made a dry, brittle snapping sound that echoed in the tiny, silent room. He pulled out a stack of folded papers. The top page was a letter, handwritten in a spidery, faded blue ink. The handwriting was shaky, the loops and crosses of a person writing under great duress. Luke angled the flashlight and began to read. "My name is Theodore Lawson. If you are reading this, I am dead." Luke's blood ran cold. "I have lived in fear for 29 years. I am a coward, and I pray God has mercy on my soul. But I cannot go to my grave without leaving this. I cannot let the truth die with me. What I have hidden here is the truth about my brother, Jonathan Lawson. John. He was a good man, the best of us. He was murdered." Luke stopped reading, his heart pounding against his ribs. He looked at the black metal box. Murdered? He returned to the letter, his eyes scanning the page faster. It was 1996. John was an activist, a man who believed in doing the right thing. He found out about a cover-up, a terrible one. It involved men with more power than I have ever known, men who could make people disappear. John was going to go to the press. He had proof. He told me. I begged him not to. I told him to think of his family, of his little girl. But he was brave, braver than I ever was. They staged an accident at his office, a gas leak, an explosion. The investigation was closed in a week. Tragic, the papers said. It was not a tragedy. It was an execution. I knew it, and they knew I knew it. I was terrified. I took his proof, everything he had collected, and I hid it. I ran. I hid his legacy in this hole, and I let them silence me. I let them destroy his name. I was so afraid they would come for me, for his daughter. The metal box contains the proof, the real ledgers, the reports, the photographs. The wooden box holds what is left of his life, pictures of his daughter, Audrey. I am so sorry, John. I was too weak. I don't know who you are, but I am paying for this storage unit with the last of my money. When I die, the payments will stop, and it will be found. Maybe you are a stranger just looking for treasure. Maybe you are God's answer to my prayer. If you have any courage, any decency, please, do what I could not. Do not let John's light go out. Get this to his daughter. Get this to the world. Theodore Theo Lawson. Luke read the letter twice, then a third time. The words blurred. He wasn't in the security office anymore. He was back in that sterile room, the smell of floor cleaner in his nostrils, listening to Alex Hunter's cold, flat voice. Operator error. The contract is vital. It was a cover-up. Luke looked at the black metal box, no longer just a heavy object, but a coffin of truth. He thought of Dean, dead and slandered. He thought of Jonathan Lawson, murdered and forgotten. And he thought of Theodore, a man so broken by fear that he had entombed his brother's legacy in the dark? This wasn't a gamble. It wasn't a mistake. It was a test. He put his head in his hands, the weight of the discovery settling over him. He had spent his last $70 not on junk, but on a ghost that was asking him to do the one thing he had failed to do for Dean, to fight back. The single beam of the flashlight turned the small security office into a cell of harsh light and deep shadow. The cold was absolute, a presence that deadened sound and slowed thought. Luke sat on the concrete, the shaky handwritten pages of Theo Lawson's confession resting on his knee. Kaiser, sensing the profound shift in his human's demeanor, the replacement of despair with a new, vibrating tension, pressed his heavy body firmly against Luke's back, a silent, warm anchor. Luke read the letter again, and then a third time. He was no longer reading it as a stranger. He was reading it as a witness. The first page had been the confession. The pages beneath it, which he had barely registered, contained the context. Theo, in his frantic, terrified script, had laid out the whole story. Jonathan John Lawson was not just his brother, he was his opposite. Where Theo was cautious, John was brave. Where Theo saw risk, John saw opportunity, not for money, but for change. John was an environmental activist, a local idealist who believed Pittsburgh's industrial scars could be healed. In 1995, John Lawson had pooled all his money to buy this very place, the abandoned Meridian Steelworks. He bought it because it was toxic, because it was a blight. His plan was to remediate the land, to clean the poison from the soil, and build something for the community. But he wasn't the only one who wanted the land. The letter named him Calvin Bishop. Even Luke, disconnected as he was from the city's affairs, had seen that name. It was etched onto the sides of sleek new buildings downtown, on plaques at university centers, and on the glossy billboards promising luxury condos. Bishop was a developer, a man who didn't just build on the skyline, he owned it. According to Theo's letter, Bishop had wanted the Meridian land. He didn't want to clean it. He wanted to bury the problem. Bishop's plan was to build a massive shipping depot, capitalizing on the river access. To do that, he needed the city to rezone the land from toxic industrial to commercial use. John Lawson found the proof. Proof of falsified environmental reports. Proof of bribes paid to city officials. Proof that Bishop was planning to build on poisoned ground, a decision that would risk the health of the entire district. John, the idealist, was going to expose him. The letter, dated 1996, described the night of the fire, the gas leak at John's small office, the investigation that lasted less than a week, the official ruling of accidental death. Luke's hand tightened on the paper. Bishop's men came to me after the funeral, Theo wrote. They knew John had kept records. They knew he trusted me. They didn't threaten me with violence. They were polite. They spoke of the future of the city. They spoke of how tragic it would be if John's young daughter Audrey were to grow up without an uncle, too. The threat was clear. Terrified, Theo had sworn he knew nothing. Bishop wanted the land, the letter continued. As John's sole heir, it was mine. He sent his lawyers. They forced me to sell. I signed their papers. I took their money. But I did one thing, one small, cowardly thing. I kept the original deed. The master title, notarized and filed, from when John first bought it. I told them it was lost in the fire. I gave them copies, signed transfers, everything they asked for, but not the original. I don't know if it matters legally. But I kept it. It's in the metal box. The box has everything, the faked permits, the ledgers showing the bribes, and the original deed to this very steel mill. Luke finally understood. Bishop had acquired the land through coercion, but the legal title was clouded. He couldn't fully secure his ownership, which must be why, 3 decades later, the Meridian Steelworks still stood, untouched and rotting. It was a monument to a crime, frozen in legal limbo. Luke carefully folded the pages and placed them back in the folder. He sat in the dark, the flashlight beam aimed at the heavy black metal box. 3 locks. He thought of the box, heavy with truth, and his mind was ripped away from the cold office. He was back in the dust, the smell of diesel, and the dry, oppressive heat. He saw Dean laughing as he fixed the winch. He saw the cheap, substandard hydraulics giving way, and he saw Captain Alex Hunter. He heard the voice, cold and final, in the sterile office. The contract is vital. A man's life, Dean's life, his honor, wiped away to protect a contract, to protect a superior's career. Luke looked at the black box. John Lawson, a good man, an idealist, murdered. His name slandered as a victim of his own carelessness. His legacy stolen, all to protect a development deal, to protect a powerful man's reputation. It was the same story. John Lawson was Dean. Calvin Bishop was Alex Hunter. A cold, visceral rage, an emotion Luke hadn't felt in years, rose in his chest. It was not the explosive anger of his PTSD, but a focused, righteous fury. He had failed Dean. He had been a sergeant, responsible for his men, and he had let Alex Hunter silence him. He had let the lie stand. That failure had broken him, had cost him his career, his faith, and his place in the world. He was a ghost, haunting the ruins of his own life, but Theo Lawson's cowardly act had just given him a second chance. This wasn't just John's fight. It was his. It was the same fight, the fight of the powerless against the corrupt, the fight for the truth, no matter how heavy, against the lie, no matter how convenient. He would not fail again. He thought of the last part of the letter, the small wooden box, pictures of his daughter, Audrey, the one Theo was too afraid to protect. Luke picked up the small, smooth wooden box. It wasn't locked. He lifted the lid. Inside, resting on faded velvet, were a few items. A child's drawing of two stick figures holding hands, labeled Daddy and Me, a small silver locket, and a stack of photographs. He pulled them out. A young man with a kind, bright smile and unruly hair, John Lawson. And in his arms, a little girl with bright eyes and pigtails, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, laughing. Audrey Lawson. She would be a woman now, in her 30s. A woman who grew up believing her father died in an accident. A woman who had her legacy, the proof of her father's bravery, stolen from her. Luke Morgan looked at the smiling face in the photograph. He had his new mission. He was no longer just a man trying to survive the winter. He was a sergeant again. And he had his orders. He carefully placed the photos back in the box. He put the box and the sealed folder into his backpack. He looked at the heavy, locked metal case. It was the objective. He turned to Kaiser, who had been watching him, head tilted, sensing the change in the air. The dog let out a small, quiet whine. "It's okay, boy," Luke said, his voice different now, stripped of its despair. "We're done hiding. We have a new mission." He would get that box open, but first he had to find the heir. He had to find Audrey Lawson. The heavy, triple-locked metal box was a tangible weight on Luke's soul. It was the objective, the proof, the entire mission. And he could not, under any circumstances, carry it with him. After a long, restless night in the cold security office, watching the flashlight beam grow weak as it rested on the box, Luke made his decision. He was a soldier without a base, a man with a vital piece of intelligence that needed to be secured. He took the metal box, still wrapped in his sleeping bag, and ventured deep into the cavernous main building of the Meridian Steelworks. He moved with a practiced stealth, Kaiser padding silently beside him. He found what he was looking for in a collapsed maintenance tunnel, a heavy, rusted iron floor plate. Using the tire iron from the storage unit, he pried it open, revealing a dark, dry crawl space beneath. He placed the box inside, covered it with his sleeping bag, and then replaced the heavy plate, scattering dust and debris over it until it looked untouched. The small wooden box of photos and Theo Lawson's letter, however, he placed in the very bottom of his backpack. Those he would not be parted from. His mission required information, and information required technology. There was only one place in the city that offered it to a man like him, no questions asked. the Carnegie Public Library in Oakland. The journey there was tense. He and Kaiser rode the bus, Kaiser's head resting dutifully on Luke's knee, his presence earning a few nervous glances, but no comments. The library, a magnificent palace of sandstone and history, loomed before them, and with it, the first hurdle. A large sign on the ornate bronze doors read, "No animals permitted, service animals only." Kaiser, for all his intelligence and loyalty, was not a registered service animal. Luke's throat tightened. He had not been separated from Kaiser for more than a few minutes in over 2 years. The dog was his anchor, the living, breathing proof that he was still connected to the world. He led Kaiser to a thick stone column near the entrance, partially sheltered from the wind. He knelt, looking the dog directly in the eyes. "I have to go in, boy," he whispered, his voice thick. "I need you to wait. You have to wait. I will be back. I promise." Kaiser let out a low, anxious whine, pressing his head hard against Luke's chest. Luke felt the dog's anxiety as if it were his own. He looped Kaiser's leash around the column, his hands shaking slightly. "Guard, wait." He stood and walked backward toward the doors, his heart pounding a sick rhythm. Kaiser sat, rigid, his eyes locked on Luke until the heavy doors hissed shut between them. The transition was jarring. Luke stepped from the biting cold into a world of profound warmth, silence, and the soft, dry scent of old paper. Students sat at long oak tables, their faces illuminated by laptops. It was a different universe. Luke felt intensely visible. His worn leather jacket, his rough beard, the dirt under his fingernails. It all felt like a stain on the pristine quiet. He kept his head down, ignoring the librarian's polite but curious glance, and found the public computer terminals in a quiet alcove. He sat down, the chair surprisingly comfortable, and took a steadying breath. He was a ghost at the feast. He flexed his cold fingers and began the hunt. First, he searched for the victim. Jonathan Lawson, 1996, Pittsburgh. The library's digital archives were fast. He found the old newspaper clippings from the Post-Gazette. Tragic gas leak, claims local activist. Investigation rules, accidental. Community mourns, John Lawson. The articles were brief, clinical, and final. They painted John as a well-meaning, but perhaps careless man. The official narrative was exactly as Theo's letter had described. A clean, closed case. Next, he searched for the killer. Calvin Bishop. The screen flooded with results. It was a digital monument to a titan. The Bishop Corporation pledges $5 million to Children's Hospital. Calvin Bishop honored as Philanthropist of the Year. New Bishop Tower to reshape Pittsburgh's skyline. Luke felt a familiar cold sickness rising in his stomach. This was Alex Hunter on a grand scale. Bishop wasn't just a man, he was an institution, shielded by a firewall of charity and civic goodwill. The man who had murdered John Lawson was now celebrated as the city's savior. The anger and futility of it made Luke's hands tremble. He thought of Dean. He thought of the lie that had buried his friend. This was the same lie, just written in marble and steel. He refocused. He was not here for the killer. He was here for the heir. He typed, Audrey Lawson, Pittsburgh. He scrolled through several results, mostly obituaries or public records for people with the same name. Then he saw it, a recent article dated just 3 weeks prior from a small local community blog. The headline read, Activist Audrey Lawson challenges Bishop Corporation's new riverfront project. Luke clicked the link, his heart hammering. The article showed a picture of a woman in her mid-30s with the same intelligent, determined eyes as the little girl in the photograph. She was standing at a podium, pointing at a map. The article detailed how Audrey Lawson, head of a community advocacy group, was formally protesting Calvin Bishop's latest development. She claimed the corporation's environmental impact studies were flawed and that they were ignoring the risk to local neighborhoods. Luke stared at the screen. She was still here, and she was already fighting him. John Lawson's daughter had grown up to continue her father's war, never even knowing it was a war. She was facing the same enemy, armed only with facts, while Calvin Bishop held the bloody, hidden truth of what happened to her father. He had to reach her. He found the website for her organization. It had a Contact Us page, a simple email form. Luke knew he couldn't use it. An email was traceable, insecure. It would be a digital flare, warning Bishop that someone was digging. He needed to do this the old way, the soldier's way. He noted the organization's office address, a small suite in a building downtown. He logged off the computer and walked to the library's small gift shop. He used the last of his change to buy a single, plain greeting card and a stamped envelope. He sat at an empty table in the main reading room, took a deep breath, and began to write. His handwriting was rough, slanted from his time in the service. He kept the message brief, sterile, and urgent. Ms. Lawson, you do not know me. I have found something that belonged to your father, Jonathan Lawson, from 1996. It is a private matter of the highest importance. I believe it contains information he was trying to protect before he died. I cannot send it electronically. I cannot bring it to your office. It is not safe. If you wish to see this, you must meet me. I am taking a great risk by contacting you. He paused, thinking. He needed to prove this wasn't a hoax. He opened his backpack and carefully took out the small wooden box. He removed one photograph, the clearest one, of John holding a 6-year-old Audrey on his shoulders, both of them laughing. He also took a page from Theo's letter, not the part about the murder, but a paragraph about John's belief in the Meridian Project. He went to the library's copy machine and made a single, grainy copy of that page. He folded the photocopy and the original photograph into the card. I will be at Shenley Park by the main fountain near the cafe. This coming Saturday at 2 p.m. I will be wearing a brown leather jacket and I will have a gray German Shepherd with me. Please come alone. He signed it simply. A friend. He sealed the envelope and addressed it to Audrey Lawson, care of her organization's office. He walked out of the library's main doors, his eyes scanning for Kaiser. The dog was exactly where he had left him, a statue of gray fur, shivering violently from the cold, but unmoving, his eyes fixed on the door. The moment he saw Luke, Kaiser sprang to his feet, his entire body racked with relief. Luke knelt and buried his face in the dog's cold ruff, his promise kept. Good boy, I'm here. He walked to the blue U.S. mailbox on the corner. He held the letter for a moment, the small white rectangle containing a 30-year-old secret. He slid it into the slot. The sound of the letter dropping into the dark metal box was soft, almost inaudible. But to Luke, it felt as final as a declaration of war. The first move had been made. Now all they could do was wait and survive. The 3 days between mailing the letter and the appointed Saturday meeting were a special kind of hell for Luke. He and Kaiser hunkered down in the cold security office at the Meridian Steelworks, existing in a state of suspended animation. Luke hoarded the last of their food, venturing out only once under the cover of darkness to retrieve the heavy, locked metal box from its hiding place. He brought it back to the office, where it sat in the corner, a dark, silent promise of either redemption or destruction. His mind replayed the mission briefs of his past. He was meeting an unknown contact in an exposed position with high-value intelligence. The scenario was agonizingly familiar. The old instincts, the hypervigilance of his PTSD, returned with a vengeance. He didn't sleep. He sat with his back to the wall, listening to the wind howl through the skeletons of the steel mill, one hand resting on Kaiser's warm, breathing flank. The dog was his only connection to the real, the present. Saturday arrived, gray and unforgiving, the sky a low, bruised purple. At noon, Luke ate the last of his rations. He fed Kaiser the remaining handful of kibble. No matter what happens today, boy, Luke said softly, scratching the dog's ears. Tonight, one way or another, I'll get you a real meal, I promise. Kaiser looked up at him, his amber eyes reflecting a deep, unwavering trust that Luke felt he had yet to earn. They left the steelworks an hour early, taking a broken roundabout path to Shenley Park. He needed to observe the objective. The park was windswept and nearly empty. The large fountain, the one he'd designated as the meeting point, was dry, its stone basins layered with brown, frozen leaves. Luke didn't go near it. He found a position on a slight rise, partially obscured by a stand of bare-branched oak trees, about 50 yards away. It gave him a clear view of the fountain, the nearby cafe, and the parking area. At 1:50 p.m., his heart began to pound a heavy military cadence. Kaiser, sensing the spike in his adrenaline, stood up from his sit, his body suddenly rigid, his gaze following Luke's. "It's all right," Luke murmured, though it was a lie. At 1:58 p.m., a practical blue sedan pulled into the lot. A woman got out. Luke's breath hitched. It was her, Audrey Lawson. She was taller than he'd expected, and she moved with a quick, impatient energy. She was in her mid-30s, wearing a sensible dark wool peacoat, jeans, and sturdy boots. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked exactly like the activist on the website, sharp, focused, and not a little intimidating. But as she drew closer, Luke saw her father's eyes, the same intelligent, determined eyes from the photograph, though hers held a weariness John's had not. She stood by the fountain, her arms crossed, scanning the empty park. She was visibly tense, almost angry, as if expecting a trap or a waste of her time. "Okay, boy," Luke whispered. "Let's go." He stepped out from the trees. Kaiser moved at his left heel, a silent gray shadow. Audrey saw them immediately. Her hand flew to her pocket, perhaps gripping her phone or keys. She took a half step back, her suspicion rolling off her in palpable waves. Luke stopped about 10 feet away, holding up one hand, palm out, in the universal sign of non-aggression. "Ms. Lawson?" His voice was rough from disuse. "You're the one who sent the letter," she stated. It wasn't a question. Her eyes darted from Luke's weathered, bearded face to the powerful dog at his side, then back again. She was calculating. "I am. My name is Luke Morgan. Thank you for coming." "You said you had something of my father's," she said, her voice sharp and clipped. "This isn't a good time for games. What is this?" Luke saw her bracing for a scam, a plea for money from a desperate man. He knew he had only one chance to break through her defenses. He kept his movements slow, unzipping his backpack and reaching inside. He pulled out the small, smooth wooden box. He didn't hand it to her. He just held it. "This belonged to him," Luke said. Audrey's eyes fixed on the box, her expression faltering. "And this," Luke continued, "was inside." He took out the original photograph, the one of a smiling John Lawson holding a laughing, pigtailed little girl on his shoulders. He held it out to her. She stared at the photo. Her professional mask, the hard shell of the activist, simply dissolved. Her breath caught in a small, sharp gasp. She stepped forward, her hand trembling as she took the small, faded square of paper. "My God," she whispered, her fingers tracing the image of her younger self. I don't have this one. I thought they were all lost in the fire." Her gaze snapped up to his, the suspicion replaced by a raw, desperate confusion. "Where did you get this?" "It was with this," Luke said. He handed her the folded, grainy photocopy of Theo Lawson's letter. She unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the shaky handwriting, her brow furrowed. Luke watched her read the paragraph about the Meridian Steelworks, about her father's dream of remediating the poisoned land. Her face went pale. The color drained from her cheeks, and she swayed, putting a hand on the cold stone of the fountain to steady herself. She was connecting the words on the page to the fight she was currently waging. "Who are you?" she asked again, but this time it was a plea. "I found these," Luke said, his voice quiet. "They were hidden in an old storage unit. Your uncle, Theo Lawson, he wrote the letter. He hid everything." "My uncle? Theo?" Audrey's voice cracked. The name seemed to wound her. He told us everything was gone. He told us to leave Pittsburgh. He said it wasn't safe." "He was afraid," Luke said. "He said your father was murdered." Audrey looked away, her gaze distant, staring at the dead leaves in the fountain. She was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was different. The emotion was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity that chilled Luke more than the wind. "I knew it," she said. "I always knew it. My mother, until the day she died, she knew it wasn't an accident." She looked up, and for the first time, Luke felt she was truly seeing him. "Mr. Morgan, you have stepped into something you do not understand." "I think I do," Luke said, his mind flashing to Alex Hunter. "It was a cover-up." "It's still a cover-up?" Audrey corrected him, her voice intense. "I'm an activist. I run a community group. For the last 6 months, I have been the primary opposition to Calvin Bishop's new riverfront development." "The Bishop Corporation," Luke said, remembering the search results. "Yes, and they don't fight fair. I thought I was just being paranoid." She began to pace, rubbing her arms. "I've had strange clicks on my phone. My office has been broken into twice, but nothing was ever taken. 2 of my biggest donors pulled their funding last month, citing unforeseen complications. They're watching me. I've known it. I've felt it." She suddenly stopped and looked around the empty park, her eyes wide with a new, dawning horror. "Oh, God," she breathed. "They're watching me, which means they saw me meet you. They saw a homeless man, a man they can't identify, pass me a package in an open park. They don't know what we discussed, but they know we met." Luke's soldier instincts took over. His gaze swept the perimeter. The park was no longer a meeting place. It was an exposed field. "We need to move." "You don't understand," Audrey said, her voice rising. "You're in danger now, both of you." Kaiser, sensing her distress, let out a low, soft whine, and Luke put a hand on his head. "I have the rest of it," Luke said, cutting through her panic. "The proof. It's in a metal box. It's locked. I have it hidden. It's safe." This stopped her. "Proof? Real proof?" "Theo's letter said so. Ledgers, permits, the original deed to the Meridian Steelworks." Audrey's eyes widened. "The deed? That's why he could never build on it. It's legally not his." She took a deep, shuddering breath, her mind clearly working fast. "We can't go to the police," she said, her voice firm. "The letter mentioned bribed officials. In this city, Bishop is the police. They'd seize the box, and you and I would disappear, one way or another." She pulled out her phone, then paused, staring at it. "They're probably listening to this too." She shoved it back in her pocket. "We have to go. We need help." "Who?" Luke asked. "There's one person," she said. "One man. His name is Mac Riley." She started walking quickly toward the parking lot, and Luke and Kaiser fell in beside her. "He's ex-FBI," Audrey explained, her voice low and rapid. "One of the best. He was building a massive public corruption case, starting in 1999. He spent 2 years digging into city officials, zoning board members, and he found the trail led right to Calvin Bishop." "What happened?" Luke asked. "What do you think? His investigation was stonewalled from the inside. His supervisors transferred his team, classified his evidence, and shut him down. They cited national security concerns after 2001, used it as an excuse to bury a local corruption probe. Mac knew it was Bishop pulling strings. He resigned, but he didn't go quietly. He's been working as a private security consultant ever since, just waiting. He hates Bishop. He's the only one I trust." "Can he open the box?" "If it can be opened, Mac can open it," she said. They reached her car. She looked at Luke, then at Kaiser. "Get in, both of you." Luke didn't hesitate. He opened the back door. "Kaiser, hup!" The big dog leaped onto the back seat. Luke climbed in after him, the first time he had been in a private car in almost a year. The clean smell of the upholstery was disorienting. Audrey got in the driver's seat, locked the doors, and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. She was staring at the small, faded photograph in her hand. "He murdered my father," she whispered. Then, her voice hardening with 30 years of stolen justice, she started the car. Let's go see Mr. Riley." Audrey drove with a focused, controlled anger. She handled the car not like a civilian, but like someone who had been expecting a crisis. Luke sat in the back, the heavy, warm presence of Kaiser pressed against his side. The dog's chin rested on the edge of the window, his gaze fixed forward, a silent co-pilot. "Mac's office isn't secure enough for this," Audrey said, her eyes meeting Luke's in the rearview mirror. "Not if they're watching me. We need the proof first. Where is it?" "The Meridian Steelworks," Luke said. Our shelter, the security office." Audrey's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "My father's mill." The words were heavy, spoken with a reverence that bordered on pain. She turned the car toward the river, toward the skeletal remains of her father's dream. She didn't park near the main road. She used an overgrown access lane, pulling the car behind a collapsed brick wall, concealing it from the street. "Stay here. Keep the engine running." "I'll be fast," Luke said. "No," Audrey said, her voice firm. "I'm coming. I need to see it." "It's not safe, not just the building." "They're watching me, Mr. Morgan. The safest place for me is right next to you, and I am not letting that box out of my sight." Luke looked at her, seeing the steel that must have defined her father. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Kaiser, with me. Guard." He led the way, slipping through the same gap in the fence he and Kaiser used as a door. Audrey followed without hesitation, her eyes wide as she took in the cavernous dead foundry. The silence of the place was immense, broken only by the crunch of their boots on frozen debris. They reached the small brick security office. Luke pushed the door open, the sound of grinding metal echoing slightly. "It's in here," Luke said, stepping inside. And then he froze. Kaiser, who had been moving just ahead, stopped dead in the doorway. The dog didn't growl. He didn't bark. He emitted a low, almost inaudible rumble from deep in his chest. His body tensed, the fur along his spine bristling. Luke felt the air change. They were not alone. "Well, well," a voice said, slick and confident. Two men stepped out of the shadows from the side of the building, blocking the exit. They were not dressed for the cold. They wore expensive-looking wool coats, unbuttoned, over dark suits. The one who spoke was in his 40s, with a smug, clean-shaven face that looked like he'd just stepped out of an office. This was Nick Sullivan. He smiled, but it was a cold, thin expression. The other man, Eric Dalton, was built like a refrigerator. He was younger, silent, his gaze flat and watchful. He was the muscle. "That's far enough," Sullivan said, his voice casual. He looked at Luke's worn jacket and rough beard with open disdain. "This is private property. You're trespassing." "We were just leaving," Audrey said, stepping forward, her voice sharp. Sullivan's smile widened. "Ah, Ms. Lawson, of course you are. We were wondering where you'd run off to. We saw you at the park, made a new friend, I see." His eyes flicked back to Luke. "You're getting into things that don't concern you, old man. This mill, this city. It's not your business. And Ms. Lawson is involved in things that are way over her head." Kaiser took one step forward, placing himself between Luke and the men. The low rumble in his chest intensified, and he lifted his lip just enough to show his teeth. Dalton, the large man, shifted his weight, his hand moving slightly inside his coat. "That's a nice dog," Sullivan said, his eyes narrowing. It'd be a shame if something happened to him. He took a step closer. "So here's the message, from people who matter. You're done. Forget you were here. Forget you ever met her. Crawl back under whatever bridge you came from. We won't ask again." Luke didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply met Sullivan's gaze. His mind was cold, his training flooding back. He assessed their stances, their hands, the exits. He recognized these men. They weren't just security. They were the modern equivalent of hunters-enforcers. This was the threat. This was the cover-up, active and breathing right in front of him. "We're leaving," Luke said, his voice a low growl that almost matched his dog's. "Yeah," Sullivan sneered. "You are." He gestured, and the two men stepped aside, leaving the path clear. They didn't know about the box. This was just an intimidation tactic, a warning shot. Luke grabbed Audrey's arm. "Go, now." He backed out of the office, Kaiser walking backward with him, his eyes never leaving the two men. Luke grabbed the heavy, locked metal box from the corner where he'd left it. It was heavy, but his adrenaline made it weightless. They walked fast, not running, back through the dead factory, the sound of their footsteps echoing. They didn't look back until they were through the fence and back in the car. Luke threw the box in the trunk, slammed it shut, and jumped into the back with Kaiser. "Go," he ordered. Audrey didn't need to be told. The car spit gravel as it spun onto the access road. "They were here," Audrey said, her voice shaking, not with fear, but with rage. "They were waiting for us." "They knew you'd come," Luke said grimly. "They're watching you, just like you said, but they don't know what we have. Not yet." "Max, now," she said, her knuckles white. Mac Riley's office was a nondescript warehouse in an industrial district, sandwiched between a plumbing supply company and a defunct tire depot. The sign on the door just said, "Riley and Associates, Risk Management." Audrey used a key to let them into a side door. The inside was sparse, professional, and smelled of coffee and ozone. A man was waiting for them in the main office. This was Mac Riley. He was in his early 60s, an African-American man with a neatly trimmed gray beard and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He wore a simple button-down shirt and a holster that was visible when he stood. He looked like what he was, a man who had left the FBI, but whose FBI training had never left him. "Audrey," he said, his voice a calm baritone. He nodded to Luke, his eyes assessing him, then dropped to assess Kaiser. "And company." "Mac, this is Luke Morgan," Audrey said, her words tumbling out. "Luke, this is Mac Riley. He found it, Mac. He found my father's proof." Luke, still carrying the heavy box, stepped forward. "They're on to us. Two of Bishop's men. They met us at the mill." Mac's calm expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. "Bishop's men? You're sure?" "Nick Sullivan and Eric Dalton," Luke said. A flicker of recognition crossed Mac's face. Bishop's personal errand boys, ex-cops, both dishonorably discharged. They've been on his payroll for years. He looked at the box. "So it's true. Set it on the table." While Luke and Audrey explained the storage unit, the letter, and the confrontation at the mill, Mac examined the black metal box. He ran his fingers over the 3 combination locks. "This is military grade," Mac said, his voice thoughtful. "Late 80s or early 90s. High-security tumbler locks. This isn't amateur hour. John was serious about this." "Can you open it?" Audrey asked, her hands clasped so tightly her fingers were white. Mac permitted himself a small, thin smile. "The Bureau teaches you how to break things, but it also teaches you how to unbreak them." He went to a workbench and returned with a set of delicate tools and a stethoscope. Kaiser, meanwhile, had finished his sweep of the office and lay down by the front door, facing it, his head on his paws, a self-appointed sentinel. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the warehouse was the faint metallic whisper of Mac's tools and the soft rhythmic click of the combination dials. He worked with the patience of a surgeon, his head pressed against the stethoscope. "1," he murmured. He heard the soft click of the first tumbler falling into place. He moved to the second lock. More turning, more listening. A quiet snick as the second pin dropped. The third lock was the most difficult. He worked at it for 10 solid minutes. Luke and Audrey watched, barely breathing. Finally, Mac nodded, satisfied. "That's 3. He released the latches, and the room was filled with a heavy thud as the internal locking bar released. He looked at Audrey. "It's your history, kid. You open it." Audrey stepped forward, her hands visibly shaking. She lifted the heavy lid. The contents were perfectly preserved. The air in the box was dry and smelled of old paper, leather, and typewriter ink. Mac began to lift the items out one by one, placing them on the table, handling them like artifacts. "Item 1, he said. A thick, leather-bound journal. Audrey opened it. Her father's neat, technical handwriting filled the pages. She let out a small, broken sound. "Item 2, Mac continued, pulling out a thick folder. Meridian zoning permits, 1995. He fanned them out. They all bore the official city seal. These have to be the fakes. Item 3. He pulled out 2 hard-backed accounting ledgers. This is it, Audrey. This is the bribe money. It's all here. Payments, dates, shell companies. And this, Luke said, pointing to the bottom. Mac reached in and pulled out the last item. It was a small black microcassette tape recorder. My God, Audrey whispered. He recorded him. As Mac was examining the ledger, his back to the door, Kaiser suddenly lifted his head. The dog didn't growl. He let out a single, high-pitched whine, almost inaudible. Then he stood up, the fur on his neck raising, and a low, threatening rumble started in his chest. "Luke," Mac said, not looking up. "The dog." "Kaiser, what is it?" Luke was at the dog's side in an instant. Mac was already moving. He crossed the room in 2 strides, went to a small, dirty window overlooking the street, and peered through the edge of the blinds. He was still for a long second. Then he let the blind fall. "Damn it," he whispered. "Audrey, you were right. You were followed. Or I was." He looked at Luke, his face grim stone. Black sedan, parked across the street, lights off. 2 occupants, Nick Sullivan and Eric Dalton. They know we're here. They know we're all together. And they know we have the box. He turned, his demeanor shifting instantly from analyst to field agent. "We have to split up. We have to move. Now." The world narrowed to the small, cold office in Mac Riley's warehouse. The sudden, terrifying knowledge that they were trapped, that Sullivan and Dalton were outside, sucked the air from the room. Audrey let out a choked sound, her hand flying to her mouth. Luke didn't flinch. He simply looked at Mac, his military calm settling over him like a second skin. "They're watching the front," Mac said, his voice a low, urgent command. He was already moving, grabbing the heavy metal box from the table. "They think we're all in here. They're waiting for us to panic." "What's the plan?" Luke asked, his voice steady. "We split," Mac said, shoving the ledgers and the journal back into the box and slamming the lid. The sound of the latches clicking shut was sharp and final. "I'm the decoy. I'll take the box. I'll take my truck. They know it. They'll follow me. It's the only prize they care about." "And us?" Audrey asked, her voice trembling. "There's a service door at the end of the back alley. It opens onto a different street. You, Luke, and the dog go out that way. Quietly. Now." "Where do we go?" "Anywhere but home," Mac said, his eyes hard. "Don't go to your apartment, Audrey. Don't use your phone. Don't use a credit card. They'll be tracking both. Go dark." "Where will we meet?" Luke asked, pulling his backpack on. "We won't. Not yet. I'm taking this box straight to Chloe, the lawyer. She's the only one in the city Bishop can't touch. She'll secure it. I'll contact her when I'm clear, and she'll find a way to contact you. Go, go." Mac moved toward the front door, the heavy box in one hand, his keys in the other. Luke grabbed Audrey's arm. "This way." He pulled her toward the back of the warehouse, Kaiser padding silently at his heels. They heard the sound of Mac's truck engine roaring to life, a defiant growl in the night. Almost immediately, it was followed by the sound of another engine, the black sedan, accelerating to follow. The decoy was working, boy. They burst through the service door into a narrow, lightless alleyway, the air biting cold. The street at the far end seemed a mile away. "He got them," Audrey breathed, a note of relief in her voice. "Not both of them," Luke said, stopping. "What?" "Listen." Audrey froze, and then she heard it. Not a car. The heavy rhythmic sound of footsteps. Someone was running, a large man, running hard, coming up the main alley. "He must have dropped him off," Luke whispered, his voice grim. "Dalton! He's on foot! He's cutting us off." He looked left, then right. The alley was a brick canyon. "This way," he hissed, pulling Audrey into a dark, narrow gap between two buildings, a space filled with dumpsters. They pressed themselves into the shadows. Kaiser stood in front of them, motionless as a statue, not making a sound. The running footsteps grew louder, a heavy, pounding cadence on the pavement. Eric Dalton ran straight past the mouth of their hiding place, his large silhouette disappearing toward the street Mac had driven down. He was chasing the truck. "We're clear," Audrey whispered, starting to move. "No," Luke said, holding her back. "Wait." He counted to 10, and then, as he had expected, the footsteps returned. Slower this time. Dalton had realized his mistake. He was coming back, checking the alleys. They were trapped. Dalton was at the T-junction, 50 yards away, scanning the darkness. Luke knelt beside Kaiser. He put his hand on the dog's ruff, his voice a bare whisper. "Kaiser, see him? Go. Get him. Go, boy. Go." He pointed, not at the man, but down the other fork of the alley, the one that led away from them. Kaiser understood immediately. He was not to attack. He was to divert. The big dog burst from the shadows, a gray streak in the darkness. He ran 20 yards down the opposite alley, stopped, and unleashed a sudden, booming series of barks, a sound that exploded against the brick walls, echoing like a cannon shot. "There!" Dalton's voice was a rough shout. "The dog!" They heard his footsteps change direction, sprinting away from them, chasing the sound of the barks. "Now," Luke said, grabbing Audrey's hand. "Go. Go left. Don't run. Walk fast. Don't look back." They moved, emerging from the gap and heading in the opposite direction, melting into the shadows of the city. They didn't stop for nearly a mile. They crossed empty lots, skirted the edges of darkened parks, and stayed deep in the industrial shadows. The adrenaline that had kept them warm began to fade, and the brutal reality of the Pittsburgh winter night set in. Audrey, the strong-willed, articulate activist who had faced down corporations, was now just a woman in a peacoat, freezing and on the run. She stumbled on a broken piece of pavement, and Luke caught her arm. She was shaking violently, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I can't," she stammered, her teeth chattering. "Luke, I'm so cold. My car, my apartment. I have nowhere to go." She looked at him, her eyes wide and desperate, in the dim light of a distant street lamp. The power dynamic had completely inverted. She was no longer the one with the contacts and the car. She was the refugee. Luke's voice was calm, steady. "I know. We're exposed here. We need hard cover. We need to get inside." "Where?" she pleaded. "Where is safe?" Luke looked toward the river, toward the black, skeletal silhouette of the Meridian Steelworks. "The one place they'll never look," he said. "The place they think we just ran from? We're going back to the mill." Audrey looked horrified. "Back there? With them?" "They're gone," Luke said. "They followed Mac. They think we're scattered. It's the last place they'd check. It's my ground. I know the layout. It's safe." She stared at him, her activist's fire extinguished, replaced by a cold, raw fear. She gave a small, defeated nod. "Okay." As if summoned, Kaiser appeared from the darkness, padding silently up to them, his mission complete. He nudged Luke's hand, then sensed Audrey's distress and gently pushed his cold nose into her glove. The walk back to the mill was a long, cold misery. But this time, Luke was in the lead. He moved with purpose, his limp a steady rhythmic counterpoint to the howling wind. When they slipped back through the broken fence, the massive dead factory felt different. To Audrey, it was a terrifying graveyard. But to Luke, it was a fortress. He led her through the echoing darkness, his movements sure and quiet. He didn't need a flashlight. He navigated the debris fields and rusted machinery from memory. Audrey stumbled behind him, wincing at every sound. They reached the small, dark security office. It was a pocket of absolute cold. Audrey huddled against the wall, wrapping her arms around herself, her body shaking uncontrollably. It's colder in here than it was outside," she whispered. "Sit," Luke said. His voice was no longer that of a homeless man. It was the quiet, confident command of a sergeant. Against that wall, it's the most insulated. He gestured to the dog. Kaiser, watch her. Kaiser, understanding the change in his human's tone, immediately lay down, pressing his large, thick-furred body against Audrey's legs. She let out a small, sharp breath as the dog's body heat began to seep into her. Luke began to work. He moved with an economy of motion that mesmerized her. He retrieved a rusted metal barrel from the corner and dragged it to the center of the room. He left the office and returned moments later with an armload of dry, splintered wood from a broken pallet he had scouted weeks ago, and a handful of balled-up dry shipping manifests from the desk. He built a small structured fire inside the barrel, a safe, contained column of fuel. He struck a single waterproof match from his pack and lit the paper. A small orange flame caught, sputtered, and then grew, casting flickering, dancing shadows on the walls. It was a tiny pinprick of life in the vast, dead building. Audrey watched him, her chattering teeth beginning to slow. He wasn't a man surviving. He was a man operating. He unzipped his backpack. He took out his small, soot-blackened cookpot and a bottle of water. He also pulled out a small foil-wrapped packet. "It's not much," he said, his voice quiet. "It's a high-energy ration bar, military issue. You need to eat." He broke the dense bar in half and handed it to her. "What about you?" she asked, her voice small. "What about Kaiser?" "We're fine," he said. "Eat." She ate. It was dry and tasted like sawdust and peanuts, but it was the best thing she had ever eaten. The warmth from the fire in the barrel, the heat from the dog at her side, and the energy from the food began to chase the deep, penetrating chill from her bones. She looked at Luke. He was sitting on the floor across from her, staring into the fire, his profile harsh and focused in the orange light. He was alert, his gaze sweeping the doorway every few seconds, but he was not anxious. He was in complete control of this hostile, broken place. In that moment, Audrey Lawson no longer saw a homeless man. She no longer saw a victim or a project. She saw a soldier. She saw a man of immense capability and quiet, profound dignity. A man who, with nothing, had just given her heat, food, and safety. A man who had more honor in his weathered, calloused hands than Calvin Bishop had in his entire polished empire. A deep, unshakable respect settled over her. "You knew exactly what to do," she said, her voice soft. Luke didn't look up from the fire. "In the service, you learn to make a home out of whatever you've got. You learn to watch, and you learn to wait." "Thank you, Luke," she said, the words feeling small and inadequate. For all of this." He gave a single, small nod. Kaiser let out a low, contented sigh and rested his heavy head on Audrey's lap, trusting her. The three of them sat in the small, cold office, illuminated by the flickering fire, a tiny, defiant island of life in the heart of the shadow, waiting for the dawn. The fire in the barrel had burned down to cold gray ash. The weak light of dawn found Luke and Audrey huddled in the security office, stiff, exhausted, and covered in grime. Kaiser, who had kept a steadfast watch between them all night, let out a low, soft whine, sensing the shift from darkness to day. Audrey looked at Luke. The shared fear and the strange, Spartan safety of the night had forged a bond between them. The gratitude and respect she felt was a solid, tangible thing. "What now, Luke?" she asked, her voice ratioy. "Now," Luke said, his own voice rough from the cold, "we take back the fight." They did not have to wait long. At precisely 7 a.m., a nondescript gray van pulled up to the collapsed loading dock near their fence gap. The driver's door opened, and Mac Riley stepped out. He gave a short, sharp whistle. Kaiser's ears shot up, and he looked at Luke. "He's clear," Luke said, relief washing over him. "Let's go." They slipped out of the mill. Mac, looking tired but energized, met them at the fence. He didn't smile. "Sullivan and Dalton followed me halfway across the state," Mac said, his voice low. "I lost them in the early morning traffic near the stadiums. But they know. They're hunting." He looked at them, his eyes sharp. Good, let them. He opened the side door of the van. Get in, both of you. Kaiser hopped in the back. Luke helped Audrey, who was stiff from the cold, and climbed in after her. Where are we going? Audrey asked. The only fortress we have left, Mac said. My lawyer's office. Mac drove them not to a towering glass skyscraper, but to a discreet historical brownstone in a quiet part of the city. The brass plaque on the door simply read, C.L. Park, Attorney at Law. The door was opened by a woman who was the physical opposite of the chaotic night they had just endured. This was Chloe. She was in her late 40s of Asian descent and wore an impeccably tailored gray suit, her black hair pulled back in a severe, elegant bun. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes were sharp, analytical, and missed nothing. She was the very definition of competence. Mac, she nodded, stepping aside. Audrey, Mr. Morgan. Her gaze lingered on Luke for a moment, taking in his worn leather jacket and the deep exhaustion in his face, then flicked to Kaiser. He's well behaved, I trust? He's a guard, not a pet, Luke said quietly. Good. Chloe led them into a large conference room. The heavy, locked metal box sat in the center of a polished mahogany table, looking like an ancient relic in a modern tomb. A man was standing by the window, coffee cup in hand. He was younger than Luke expected, perhaps mid-30s, with a rumpled shirt, restless energy, and the skeptical eyes of a man who had heard every lie. This is Jake Miller, Chloe said by way of introduction. He's the best investigative reporter in this city, and the only one I trust. Jake nodded at them. This is a hell of a story, if it's true. It's true, Audrey said, her voice finding its strength. That's what we're here to prove, Chloe said, taking her seat at the head of the table. Good morning. Mac, Mr. Miller, and I have been busy while you were unavailable. She gestured to the table. The original box is here. It is also now on a secure server, with copies in 3 different states. The ledgers, the journal, everything. The microcassette is currently with a forensic audio specialist. We should have the restored file by tomorrow. She then folded her hands. But I didn't wait. Using the names from John Lawson's journal, I started making calls. It turns out your father wasn't the only accident connected to Bishop's projects in the late 1990s. Audrey looked up, her face pale. What? 6 other men, all died in unforeseen accidents on Bishop-related sites between 1996 and 1998. I have already been in contact with a representative for 3 of those families, a woman named Anna Parker. She is very motivated to join our civil suit. Audrey looked stunned. This was no longer just about her father. It was a conspiracy. As if on cue, Chloe's desk phone emitted a soft, polite chime. Her assistant's voice came over the intercom. Ms. Park, I have a Mr. Chris on line 1. He says he's counsel for the Bishop Corporation. A heavy silence fell over the room. Luke looked at Mac. Mac just nodded, his face grim. They were faster than he thought. Chloe pressed the speakerphone button. This is Chloe. To whom am I speaking? A voice, smooth as oiled glass, filled the room. Good morning, Ms. Park. My name is Chris. I represent the interests of Mr. Calvin Bishop. It has come to our attention that you are in possession of some archival materials belonging to his organization. My client is a reasonable man. He understands that misunderstandings happen. He has requested a brief, informal meeting to discuss rectifying this situation. I'm not sure we have anything to discuss, Mr. Chris, Chloe said, her voice like ice. Oh, I think you do, the lawyer purred. My client is prepared to make a very generous offer to Ms. Lawson for her father's personal effects. Shall we say 10 a.m., our office? No, Chloe said instantly. My office, 10 a.m., and your client must be present, not just his lawyers. There was a pause on the line. That is unusual, but I will convey your request. See you at 10. The line clicked, followed by a dial tone. Jake Miller, the reporter, looked like he'd just been handed the story of the year. Audrey was shaking. He wants to buy us off. He wants to know what we have, Mac corrected her, and who we are. Luke said nothing, but his hand unconsciously clenched into a fist. He was finally going to meet him, the man in the tower, the Alex Hunter of Pittsburgh. At precisely 10 o'clock, the conference room doors opened. 3 men entered. The man in the lead was Calvin Bishop. He was an older man, perhaps 80, but he was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark, custom-tailored suit, and moved with the slow, assured vigor of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. He had a full head of white hair and the calm, almost kind eyes of a philanthropist. He was the man whose name was on hospitals. Behind him was Chris, the lawyer, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. And behind him was a younger man in his late 20s, his suit sharp and modern, his eyes nervous. This was Ben Bishop, the grandson, the heir apparent to the Bishop Corporation. He looked less like a conspirator and more like a modern CEO who was deeply uncomfortable with this entire, messy, analog situation. Luke stared at Calvin Bishop. He saw the kind eyes, the confident posture, the aura of untouchable authority. And all he could see was Captain Alex Hunter. He saw the man who had signed a paper and turned his friend Dean's death into a lie. His blood ran cold. Kaiser, who was lying under the table at Luke's feet, let out a single, low growl, sensing the wave of cold fury coming off his human. "Ms. Park, Ms. Lawson," Bishop said, his voice a practiced, grandfatherly baritone. He nodded to Mac. "Mr. Riley, it has been a long time." He then looked at Luke. The kind eyes vanished. His gaze swept over Luke's worn jacket and weathered face with a flicker of analytical dismissal. This was the source of the problem, the variable. "Please sit," Chloe said, not offering coffee. Chris, the lawyer, began. "As I mentioned, my client, Mr. Bishop, values this city's history. He was a contemporary of Mr. Lawson's. He deeply regrets the tragedy and wishes to ease Ms. Lawson's burden. We are prepared to offer $8 million for your father's effects and a full confidentiality agreement." Audrey, who had been silent, spoke. Her voice was clear and did not shake. "My father's memory isn't for sale." Calvin Bishop smiled, a patient, patronizing expression. "My dear, this is a 30-year-old misunderstanding. Papers get lost, stories get confused. This is a chance for everyone to walk away whole." "No one walks away from this whole, Mr. Bishop," Chloe interjected. She slid a copy of John Lawson's journal across the table. "We have the ledgers. We have the permits. We know about the bribes." Chris scoffed. "Circumstantial. The words of a dead man. It will never hold up." "Then perhaps," Chloe said, "you're more worried about the living. I've been retained by Anna Parker." The name landed on the table like a grenade. Luke saw Ben Bishop, the grandson, flinch. Chris, the lawyer, lost his smile. "Anna Parker," Chloe continued, "is the representative for the families of the 6 other men who died on your sites. She is very eager to have her day in court. I imagine Mr. Miller here will be just as eager to write about it." Calvin Bishop's grandfatherly mask finally cracked. His eyes turned to steel. "You? And then there's the tape," Chloe finished. "The audio of your meeting with John Lawson 3 days before he died. The one where you discussed the cover-up." The room was silent. Calvin Bishop was staring at Chloe, his face a mask of cold fury. He had been completely outmaneuvered. It was Ben, the grandson, who finally broke the silence. He was pale, his eyes darting between Chloe and his grandfather. He wasn't looking at the past. He was looking at the stock market. "Grandfather," Ben said, his voice low and urgent, his MBA-trained mind doing the math. "The press, the other families, a criminal investigation. This isn't a lawsuit. This is an extinction event. Our stock will be worthless by noon." "Be quiet, Ben," Calvin snapped. "No," Ben insisted, standing up. "I won't. This is my company too, my future. That story breaks, and Bishop is a toxic name. We're ruined." He looked at Chloe, not with morals, but with pure pragmatism. "What do you want?" Chloe smiled. "My client wants the truth. A full public admission of your role in the safety violations and the cover-up that led to the deaths of Jonathan Lawson and the other 6 men. The establishment of a $20 million compensation fund for the families. And a $30 million endowment for a new city fund for workplace safety, named after the victims. Impossible, Chris, the lawyer, blustered. It's that, Jake Miller said quietly from the corner, or my story runs on the front page tomorrow. Your choice. Ben Bishop looked at his grandfather. Control the damage, sir, he pleaded. It's the only move we have left. We have to control the narrative. Calvin Bishop sat back in his chair. He looked defeated. Not by justice, Luke realized. Not by morality. He was defeated by business. He had been cornered by a balance sheet. He stared at Luke, at Audrey, at Mac. His eyes were no longer kind. They were filled with a pure, bottomless hatred for the people who had pulled this from the grave. Draft the agreement, Calvin Bishop said to his lawyer, his voice a dead monotone. We'll sign it. The silence that followed Calvin Bishop's capitulation was heavier and more profound than any noise. It was the sound of a 30-year-old weight settling, of a ghost finally being heard. Calvin Bishop, a man who had been a titan of the city, looked, for the first time, like what he was, a frail, bitter old man. His grandson, Ben, was already on the phone with their PR team, his voice a low, urgent monotone, speaking in the bloodless language of damage control and managed narratives. Luke, Audrey, and Mac watched as Chloe, the lawyer, slid the finalized settlement across the polished mahogany table. Bishop's hand, holding the expensive pen, was steady. He signed his name with a sharp, angry finality. It was not the signature of a man repenting. It was the signature of a king abdicating. The moment it was done, Bishop and his team left without another word. Jake Miller, the reporter, looked at the remaining group. He had his story. It runs tomorrow, he said, giving a respectful nod to Audrey and Luke. Thank you. The next morning, the city woke to a different world. The front page of the Post-Gazette, in bold, stark type, read, The Meridian Betrayal. Bishop admits 30-year cover-up, 6 deaths linked to fraud. Jake Miller's story was a masterpiece of investigative journalism. It laid out everything. The murder of Jonathan Lawson in 1996, disguised as an accident. The faked environmental reports, the bribed officials, the 6 other families represented by Anna Parker who had lost loved ones. And at the center of it, the quiet discovery of a hidden metal box by a local veteran. Luke read the story on a newspaper he'd bought with a $5 bill Mac had pressed into his hand. He sat on a cold bench, the city roaring to life around him, with Kaiser at his feet. He saw Calvin Bishop's picture, the same philanthropic smile, now looking like a grotesque mask. He thought of Alex Hunter. He thought of Dean. He felt no joy, no triumph, just the quiet, heavy click of a lock finally falling into place. It was the end of a war he hadn't known he was still fighting. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. As Ben Bishop had predicted, the name was toxic. The Bishop Corporation's stock plummeted. The City Council convened an emergency session to review every contract Bishop had ever signed. The university and the hospital, their names now stained by association, announced they would be removing Bishop from their wings and halls. The empire, built on lies and buried bodies, crumbled under the weight of the truth. Justice, it turned out, was not just a moral victory, it was a financial catastrophe. Weeks passed. The sharp cold of winter began to ease, replaced by the damp, muddy promise of spring. Luke and Kaiser remained at the Meridian Steelworks. It was still their shelter, but it felt different. They were no longer hiding. They were guarding. Mac and Audrey visited regularly, bringing food, supplies, and for Kaiser, heavy bags of high-quality kibble. The hollow-eyed hunger that had defined them was gone. One brisk March afternoon, Audrey arrived, but not just for a visit. She found Luke reinforcing the security office door, a task he was performing with a meticulous, practiced skill. "Luke," she said, her voice bright with an energy he hadn't heard before. Audrey. He nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. Kaiser trotted over, greeting her with a respectful nudge of his nose. "The settlement is finalized," she said. "The funds for the families, including Anna Parker's, have been transferred. The compensation is... it's done." "That's good," Luke said. "That's right." "And the land," she said, looking around the vast rusting yard. "The Shuangjuch Thep Meridian Coup, my father's mill. It's officially, uncontestedly, mine." She took a deep breath. "The developers are circling, of course. They see acres of prime riverfront property. They're offering a fortune to take it off my hands." "You're going to sell," Luke stated. It was the logical move. "No," Audrey said, a fierce, bright smile on her face. "I'm not. I'm going to finish what my father started." Luke looked at her, confused. "I'm using the settlement money, the money Calvin Bishop paid in his own name, to redevelop this place," she explained, her arms wide. "I'm not building condos. I'm building a community, affordable housing for working families, a public green space, a community support center." She then turned, her expression softening, and looked directly at Luke. "And a dedicated wing for veteran support services, a place for men and women like you who were promised one thing and given another." Luke was floored. He could only stare at her. That's a good thing, Audrey. That's a fine memorial." "It's not a memorial, Luke," she said. "It's a future, but I can't do it alone. It's a massive project. I need someone to run this site, someone to manage the redevelopment, the maintenance, the security, someone who already knows this place, who knows its bones, someone who knows how to keep things working, how to build something from nothing, how to keep people safe." She took a step closer. "I need someone I trust." Luke's heart hammered. He looked down at his worn, dirty clothes. "Audrey, I'm a homeless man. I don't know anything about—" "Stop," she interrupted, her voice firm but full of kindness. "Don't you dare say that. I am not offering you charity, Luke. I am offering you a job." She touched his arm. "I will never forget that night in the alley or in this office. I'm an activist. I'm used to talking, to fighting with words. But when we were in real danger, when I was freezing and falling apart, you were in command. You were calm. You were a soldier. You built a fire. You secured the perimeter. You managed the crisis. You protected me. That is the man I want managing this property. I am offering Sergeant Luke Morgan the position of Head of Management and Maintenance for the Meridian Community Project." Luke looked at her, and for the first time in years, he felt a sharp, burning sensation behind his eyes. He saw the respect in her face. It was not pity. It was a job offer from one professional to another. He had been a ghost for so long, he had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. He cleared his throat, the words thick and unfamiliar. Yes, I accept." 6 months later, the Meridian Steelworks was unrecognizable. The howl of the wind through broken steel had been replaced by the roaring of bulldozers, the whine of saws, and the shouts of a construction crew. The rusted, dangerous sections were coming down, but the core of the old mill, the strong brick foundations, were being saved. Luke Morgan stood at the window of his new office, which had once been the cold, dark security room. It was now bright, clean, with drywall, fresh paint, and a blueprint of the new complex spread across his desk. He wore a clean navy blue work shirt with a small embroidered patch on the breast. Meridian Community. He was leaner, his face still weathered, but the deep, haunted lines of despair around his eyes were gone. His hair was shorter, the silver at his temples a mark of distinction, not decay. A sound came from the door, a soft click of nails on the new tile floor. Kaiser padded in, his gray and white coat thick and brushed. He walked to Luke and rested his heavy head on his hand. "Time for our walk, boy?" Luke murmured, scratching the dog's ears. He looked down at his partner, the one constant, the cold anchor that had become his warm, living compass. The dog who had found a hidden wall and, in doing so, had found a future for them both. They walked out into the late afternoon sun. Their apartment, one of the first units completed, was on the second floor of the newly renovated administrative building. It was small, just 2 rooms, but it had heat that worked, a refrigerator full of food, and a clean, soft bed. Luke looked up at the framework of the new community center rising from the ashes of the old mill. He thought of John Lawson, the man who had dreamed this place. He thought of Dean, the friend whose memory he had finally honored by fighting for someone else. He was no longer a ghost. He had a mission. He had a home. And as Kaiser trotted faithfully at his side, Luke Morgan, for the first time since he had taken off his uniform, felt a profound and lasting peace. This story reminds us that even when the world forgets you, the loyalty of one true friend can be the anchor that holds you steady. Kaiser's faith in Luke and Luke's trust in him was the small spark that brought a 30-year-old truth to light. If this bond moved you, we invite you to be part of our Veteran Dog Tales family by subscribing. Your likes and comments let us know these stories matter, and sharing them helps this community grow. And the next tale of honor is already here. Please click the video now playing on your screen to continue the journey with us.